So, to begin, maybe Ben, you can start. What's happening now at your organization in terms of funding priorities, and do you anticipate changes in future funding priorities?
Yeah, I'll preface this by saying the obvious, and we didn't test the mic, so I hope you can everybody hear?
Yes.
Yeah. The foundation community is like a herd of cats in terms of we don't particularly play well together, we hiss at each other a lot, and we're all driven by our own individual priorities and our stewardship of relevant funds. At our particular foundation, our normal process is that every 5 years we conduct a series of national field conversations. Based on those conversations, we present to our board a strategy or a set of strategic priorities that will inform our giving for the next 5 years. As the steward of Doris Duke's money, which is what I do in the arts program, I'm guided by language in her last will and testament that says specifically our job is to invest in artists, in actors, singers, dancers, and musicians in the public performance and presentation of their work, which is a directive that makes me believe, and our board believe, that we should invest all of our money in professional artists who work in jazz, because Doris was a jazz musician. She liked jazz when no one else did. She did not go to orchestras or opera. She was a jazz lady. So we're in jazz. We're in modern dance, or as we often say, no tutus and toe shoes, but we're in modern dance. We're in theater, and we're in organizations that nurture, present, or produce artists in jazz, modern dance, and theater. So my portfolio is very specifically guided by instructions in the will. That 5-year cycle, to be totally candid, we come up on next year, so we're just in the process of organizing conversations that will happen in late 15 and early 16 in order to present a new set of strategic priorities in 17. To date, our intersection with this particular constituency has been through the Association of Arts Presenters. Scott Stoner's here, some of you may have heard him speak, around an initiative called Creative Campus, which supported the kinds of projects many of you have. More recently, the most recent iteration has specifically been through our sister program, the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art, whose purpose is to broaden American understanding of Muslims and Islam through the arts. And so those Creative Campus projects have had a Muslim/Islamic focus in the most recent iteration. That's a long way of saying that as we look forward to the future, that language about who we fund and the priority fields will not change. That's in the will. We will not be funding design or architecture. It's just not there for us to do. Whether we will move more aggressively into the terrain of universities, I think we're going to hear that through conversations in the next year. If I'm going to be totally frank, I don't anticipate that being a growth area for us. And if you want to talk after everybody's laid out sort of where they are, I'll be glad to talk about why that is.
Well, that was a great introduction to the world of foundations. Since Ben was actually trained in the theater and I am not, I don't have that beautiful boom of a projected voice, so I want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Great. So I am with the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and it was very interesting to hear Ben speak about the power of the will, because I'm happy to say that the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation is not so constrained. That comes with advantages and disadvantages, of course. The advantage is that you can adjust what you give money to as you see needs change. Of course, Ben does that too, but you can do it perhaps with a little bit more direction. Now, many of you know and have worked with the Mellon Foundation before. We exist almost 50 years. We go back to 1969, when the son of Andrew W. Mellon, the erstwhile industrialist of the early 20th century, late 19th century, Secretary of the Treasury, founder of the National Gallery of Art, when his son and daughter essentially merged their inheritance and made this single foundation. And it really had a very flexible charter that was basically about doing good in the world, more or less aligned the kinds of things that Paul and Ilse Mellon, these two children, were interested in. And they were interested in art. At the time, they were very worried about population growth. They cared a lot about hunting grounds and rural lands and things like that, gardening. And so initially, the foundation did a lot of that stuff. But really, for as long as probably you have worked or maybe not been aware of the foundation, the essential commitment has been to the humanities and the arts with a little piece in conservation and the environment. Now, we just went through the lovely exercise that Ben described, the strategic planning, which was kind of a new thing for us because, you know, there was this sort of flexibility. The foundation kind of moved along as board members came on and off, presidents came and went, and we haven't had very many of them over time. So there wasn't really often felt the need to do strategic planning. We're kind of an old foundation in that way. But we decided a year and a half ago, time to do some check-in with ourselves to see if we are still listening to the right conversations and putting our money where it matters most. And essentially, the big news here is that I don't anticipate massive changes in the next few years because we just affirmed and rolled out our strategic plan. And that strategic plan has 5 pillars. But the first thing to say about, before I get to the pillars is we basically affirmed that in this moment of severe pressure on higher education, the humanities and the arts, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation will recommit as never before, in fact, to those sectors, higher education, the humanities and the arts. And that meant, in fact, for example, closing our conservation and the environment program, even though that's achieved a lot of good things, there is a lot more funding in the philanthropic world for those areas. So, in fact, we see somewhat of an increase in our arts, humanities, and higher education funding. Now, what's, I think, really relevant for this group and this meeting here, and one of the reasons that we have funded, as I think you know, Arts Engine's research project that's ongoing about best practices in the arts and research universities. The important thing to realize is that although we have 5 different grant-making programs, we have every opportunity as a fairly small organization to be nimble and to connect them. And the 5 areas we have in which we make grants are higher education and scholarship in the humanities. That's our biggest program by far. Research universities, liberal arts colleges primarily. The second is arts and cultural heritage, which combines with under one umbrella these ever more fluidly interacting areas of art history conservation museums, visual arts on one hand, performing arts on the other. We do work in both areas under the arts and cultural heritage umbrella. Then we have scholarly communications, so that's university publishing, and so forth. We have a sizable program in diversity, which is very much focused on diversity of the American professoriate and the community, the student community, but also begins to work in that arts and cultural heritage area a little bit. And the last is a program we expect to expand in international higher education and strategic partnerships, which can work across all of the areas I just described. Now, that means that what these 5 pillars do, and they're newly defined really under the strategic plan, they really draw on work we've done the last 4 or 5 years to try to connect our programs better, and especially to embark on this inquiry with the University of Michigan and Arts Engine to ask the question, how can the arts and higher education work better together? And there are really good reasons for asking that, and we can go back to them after the colleagues here have had a chance to say what they're doing.
Well, I'm Carlos Manjarrez from the Institute of Museums and Library Services, a federal agency that many of you may not have heard of. And I'll talk a bit about IMLS, but I think we'll meander into federal giving in a little bit later. But IMLS is typically thought of as one of the 3 cultural agencies within the federal government. An annual budget of $226 million. And a good chunk of that money goes out in the form of block grants. Block grants to state library agencies. 67% actually goes out in the form of population-based formula block grants. And those funds are redistributed from the state level to the local level in varying ways. Sometimes it's subgrants, sometimes it's the state library agencies themselves are running programs at the state level. And so with 50 states, the District of Columbia and surrounding territories, you can imagine there are all sorts of models. The rest of the money is distributed in discretionary grants. And we, like the Mellon Foundation, are at the end of a strategic planning period. One of the additional variables, obviously as a public agency, is the annual appropriation process. There was a hiccup in the last fiscal year, you all know. And so that has its own challenges. But there's also our legislative authorization. So IMLS is actually, among the 3 cultural agencies, is really the only one that's operating under a current authorization. And we were reauthorized in 2010. We're up for reauthorization again soon. And so that reauthorization, I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. It's a moment where Congress makes an affirmative statement about what it is this agency is about, what it's intended to do. And in our last reauthorization, there was a tremendous amount of language that really did connect library and museum services with a number of different policy areas. And this is something that's new for the agency, new within our authorization. IMLS is a young agency, really was formed in 1996, so we're a baby in many ways. A very small agency. I think that's in part a function of when the agency was born. So there's less than 70 FTEs at this agency. And so it's, it might be a little weird for some because though we're distributing more than $80 million in the NEA, we have about half the staff. So that's just an artifact, I think, of when we were born and how FTEs are distributed within the federal government, which we can talk about offline. And I work within a new agency, I work in a new shop. And it's a policy research shop within IMLS. And this is also as a function of our recent reauthorization. And I mention that because there are, among NEH, NEA, and IMLS, only 2 have a research shop. And IMLS is the only one that has a program within the federal statistical system. Those of you that are familiar with the federal statistical system know that it is, like the federal government, really incredibly decentralized. So BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, sits within Labor, NCES sits within Department of Education, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't have a centralized federal statistical system. We have a very decentralized federal statistical system. But I mentioned the fact that we have a cultural agency with a federal statistical program because that really does affect my work a great deal. A lot of what I do is focusing on the way in which library and museum services, cultural programming, is really integral to American life. If you think about the federal statistical system, there's a tremendous amount of information that's gathered about social problems, whether it's health issues, whether it's criminal issues, whether it's housing problems. And IMLS is collecting what I like to characterize as pro-social information. The character of youth services in libraries across the country. The distribution of museum services across the United States. And talking to my federal colleagues about the ways in which this information contributes to a broader understanding about community, an understanding of the way in which our culture, informal science learning are all integral part of the American life in rural areas, in urban areas, and suburban areas. So I'm constantly sharing data with federal colleagues in HUD, in labor, who never had any idea, they had no idea that we have detailed information about library services at the local level, geocoded information that they can take up and they can incorporate in their own livability indices. So, I'm sorry, I veered off on my tangent, but I stopped talking about funding. I think that I don't know what the future holds exactly for IMLS and other agencies. The annual appropriation process has been a little rockier than it has been in recent years. I won't predict the future. However, that said, I think one of the most significant changes won't necessarily be in terms of the annual appropriations to individual agencies. I think one of the most significant changes for federal giving for arts and culture is going to come as a result of open data and the way in which information is made available about discretionary grant making across the federal government. And also, it's going to come from grant reform that comes under the general title of COFAR. And I'll get into some of the details about that in a little bit, but I'll stop there.
So I'm kind of a hybrid here. I'm one of you as a research university individual, but having worked at NEA. So I'll give a little NEA, and then maybe I'll give a little bit of a broader comment. But I mean, currently you may have seen as you participate in applications, NEA, of course, is supporting artistic excellence and artistic merit. So these are the things that are looked at when your projects are reviewed. And more recently, if you've watched the Granting with the Art Town project and the collaborative Art Place America, you've seen a pursuit of examining livability and livability in communities. So that was a new focus for the Arts Endowment. You've also seen under the arts education programming an effort to take the philosophy of collective impact, which is something that I think came out of Stanford, and see how we can better partner with local organizations, universities, and arts education deliverers, whether that's a school or an out-of-school program, to kind of have a bigger impact on improved access to arts education for students. And in addition to livability, collective impact, the NEA now has a research portfolio. So for the first time, the revolutions may be kind of quiet, but it is somewhat revolutionary that the NEA has been giving grants now for about two years in the third cycle, I think, of research grants, which is using data that's available to understand what's happening in research in arts and culture, the value of arts and culture to the economy, what's happening with existing education data from the Department of Education in terms that can be unpacked in terms of arts education. So this is kind of a portfolio that Sunil Iyengar, who's the director of research, oversees, and it's actually a big opportunity for the university community. And so he urged me to, the deadline's in November, so you would, if you didn't know about it now, look toward the future deadline, because I think they really would like to see diverse approaches to thinking about the value of arts and culture in our communities. And specifically, these interdisciplinary projects that you work on are not necessarily the norm. His portfolio is really looking at analyses that are more social science oriented, so it's not arts research in terms of someone working in the studio arts research, it's really analyses of existing data. But I think they're hoping to maybe open up. It started with very specific data sets, and now it's becoming kind of more open so that you can propose certain questions and concerns. So, for example, the emergence of the Alliance for Research Universities was something because the community came together and said, we have this need. Well, we might say, like, how can we look at existing data to demonstrate that need, to understand what the responses should be to the needs that we have in this community. And that's maybe a kind of project that could be linked to what's happening in research. I would also say that there's been a huge effort recently on increasing the federal effectiveness in terms of NEA partnering with other federal agencies. So you may have seen a recent guideline that came out. There was a partnership with the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which is part of NIH. They have a new program that is arts-based approaches to palliative care. So that's an example of a program that's not coming out of NEA, but was the result of several years of conversations in order to present a portfolio that's art-focused within that center. There was a lot of hard work, I think, that led to that occurring. So you see more and more, you have programs at HUD and other agencies that have allowed artists to be eligible, or arts organizations to be eligible for the funding. So there's greater focus on sort of, that's a kind of federal collective impact effort. But one thing I wanted to note is that I did want to give a little reflection back to you in terms of what we're seeing in 2014, in terms of the kinds of projects that you're all doing, and how the NEA is funding those projects, and how much money is this group kind of getting from the NEA. And before I say that, while federal funding and national funding is so important to kind of these individuals can really see the big picture of where strengths and weaknesses are in the field, so it can really help us understand how to push our work forward, what gaps there are, how to improve opportunities for artists. I would also remind us that the greatest funding in the US for arts and culture and design is at the local level. So although these incredible Americans have contributed their inheritances to the American public and made them available to you to apply for, these are individuals who are making those donations. And I think that on the community level, the last report from Grant Makers in the Arts, I think it was $777 million was given at the local level to arts and culture. And then when you look at the state level, it's $317 million. And then when you look at the NEA, the NEA budget right now is $146 million, but 40% of that goes to state arts agencies. So the NEA budget is $83 million that's available in essence. And so if you're thinking about funding strategies, I think you have to remember that even though we as universities work on a national level to demonstrate our excellence in the kind of work we do, we have the peer review, we have to be successful nationally and internationally as scholars. The bulk of our support in the United States is coming from the person next door. And you don't know who that person next door might be. It might be Doris Duke, or
She's dead.
Well, it might not be. So that's just a reminder that we live in a very complex funding environment and a complex policy environment in terms of what kinds of things are guiding us. So let me just give you a quick recap of if I looked at the data for 2014 activities in terms of this group. And one reason I wanted to do this is when I was Arts Education Director at NEA, there was no group of universities that were coming to us and advising us on the direction of how we should support performing artists, how we should support designers, how we should support visual artists. We didn't have, like we have TCG, Grant Makers in the Arts, we have APAC advising the NEA. There's not a university collaborative that assists in informing us what young artists need, what the up-and-coming generation needs, or what the field or sector needs as a whole. So I have sometimes looked at the data to determine like how much money are you getting, what is the sector of universities when it comes to NEA thinking about its investments. So for the activities between 2014 and 2016, there are 244 grants. So NEA generally gives about 2,100 grants. There's 244 grants that are projects led by or with university partnerships. So within that, and that's a total investment about $5.58 million. So 244 projects, that's a lot of work to get $5.58 million. But the other thing about the NEA funding is that 5.58 is leveraging possibly triple, quadruple that amount within your local community and within other opportunities. If we take out the many projects that are partners, where the communities are leads, but the universities are part of those projects, there's 155 grants that are led by universities, and it goes down to about 3.3 million. So this is actually, we're commanding, I guess, 64% of these grants, but 57% of the funding within these university grants. The largest grants are being provided to the Our Town project portfolio. So those are around $100,000. These are the grants that are developing livability in our communities with the help of artists and designers. So for example, South Dakota got a grant for $150 to support a master plan for an art center. I have other examples, but I wanted to note that out of the 155 grants led by universities, 16 are A2RU member organizations. So I don't know what you think about that number. Just half of us are doing projects supported by the NEA this year. Of these 16 institutions, there's 25 grants. I want to note University of Virginia, University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Arizona, University of Utah, University of Iowa are some of the schools that are getting more than one grant during the season. So some of us know how to leverage more than just one project a year. And these grants are between $10,000 and $50,000, so they're not massive grants. And some of our colleagues are kind of leveraging the larger grants. How much money is awarded with those 25 grants to this group? It's about $552,000. So I don't know how that sounds to you. This is perhaps, we as H2RU members are getting 17% of the funding where universities are the lead applicants. So that could be a significant, I suppose. But then the other thing I kind of want to pose to the group, many of these projects are performances. They're very traditional. I could only find 2 projects that were interdisciplinary. So one was at UVA, one was at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we really are going to the NEA to endorse artistic excellence. And that may be necessary because that's their mission. Those are the projects they want to see. But it's worth a conversation, and I think they're having it internally. What kinds of conversations and projects should be happening between NEA and NSF? That's a conversation that's happening. But how does an agency whose core mission is artistic excellence begin to think about projects that are of a different kind of complexity that you've been talking about the last couple of days? I just want to remind you, though, within this, say, $552,000 investment that the NEA is making within your projects, you're a sector, we had, so I'll just wrap up with this. The NEA used the Bureau of Economic Analysis data to look at our investment in the economy, the arts sector investment in the GDP. What they found was surprising regarding arts education, post-secondary arts education. So arts education, the work we do in higher education, adds $7.6 billion to the nation's GDP. So we are fighting for these NEA grants to get this support that we're for our specific projects. And at the same time, we're a sector that provides $7.6 billion to the U.S. economy. So I think there's a conversation to be had there about how it is that we turn around and can support our federal agencies as they try to push the value of the arts within the public discourse and the political discourse in the United States. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
You know, actually, as we began to talk, I sort of have this metaphoric vision of sort of who we are and what we say, and I hope I don't offend my colleagues on the panel. I feel like listening to us is the equivalent of driving an arts car and hearing what you'd see in your rearview mirror. And what I mean by that is, when we look at the future of arts philanthropy in this country and arts funding, I think organized philanthropy will play less and less and less, organized arts philanthropy will play less and less and less a critical role, despite the historic role it's played. If you look at the big arts funding picture, what you know is arts funding is growing in all 3 government sectors, but you know the share of the contributed dollar to the arts is going down. You know the matched largest foundations are giving less to the arts. You know that the number of grants is increasing faster than the amount of money is increasing. You know that the median arts grant in the United States now, which is $25,000, was $25,000 in 1993. It has not budged one dime in 21 years, and that's not even counting inflation. We were deeply important in the past, and we still are, but if I were to look horizontally, where I'm seeing growth in arts funding is, especially for your universe, in the partner areas with which you're working. You know, we're seeing growth because in funding, when we funded the University of Michigan Medical School to hire musicians to teach young doctors how to listen better, they're so excited the medical people are paying that bill entirely now, and they're hiring the musicians, and we're out of the game. And where you look at what the other people can leverage, that's likely to be the growth arena, not the arts money. And especially when I think the future, what we already know is, of every contributed dollar in the United States right now, 80 cents comes from an individual. We, plus corporations, split 20 cents out of the dollar. And given that you have alumni networks, individuals, et cetera, individual fundraising is skyrocketing. And if I were to look further out at what I thought was important, I would say partnerships are more important. The biggest win in government funding has been, in the last 20 years that I know of, is Minnesota Legacy Fund, which is going to throw billions of dollars to the arts. But that's a partnership with the arts, clean air, clean water, and wildlife to protect the irreplaceable legacies in Minnesota. So we're going to protect clean water. We're going to protect for our children clean air. We're going to protect the arts, but that's a partnership, not an arts initiative. And when I really look at the future of fundraising is Ice Bucket Challenge. And I mean that in all honesty. 750,000 new donors, raised $42 million. It's still moving on the ascendant. And we're moving into a time when we talk about funding, if we're thinking about organized grant requests and the world is starting to march to digital fundraising, we are totally going to miss that boat. And before I shut up about this, I would just say, because I'm now on a tirade.
It's very entertaining. This is an art conference.
What I would say about digital fundraising that we know is, number one, it accounts for 6.7% of giving, but it's growing 250% a year in terms of its previous amount. We know the average gift is $147 online versus an average gift of $847 live. We do know, however, Multiple Sclerosis Society raises 33% of their money online. Red Cross raises over 10%. They raise over $1 billion a year online. And when you think about the online potential of growth, that's where we're going. And for my generation, the big thing we're going to have to encounter is shifting out of a digital tool mindset, a digital tool orientation into a digital mindset. What I mean by that is, I think of technology as a digital tool. We advertise in the newspapers, now we're advertising online. We did a letter writing campaign through the hard mail, now we'll do it through email. That's a tool. Digital mindsets look at how we live and use digital technology as a leverage point to leverage money. I'm going to give you 3 fast examples. If you know Charity Alarm Clock, it's an app. Every time you hit the snooze button on your alarm clock, it channels money from your bank account to a charity. If you know Charity Miles, you set a fitness agenda for yourself. Every time you hit a certain benchmark, it leverages money into a charity of your choice. Or Feedy, which is my new favorite, which is recognizing that we're obsessed with selfies now. Feedy's, for participating restaurants, if you take a picture of your meal and you post it online, the restaurant donates a meal in its entirety to a food relief place. These mindset people are using the way we live to leverage resources. They're not trying to exploit technology to do what we did for fundraising for the last 30 years. And if we're talking about the future of fundraising for this group, I would urge us to think aggressively about individuals in a digital mindset rather than how to write a more effective grant to a foundation that's been working for the last 30 years.
Here, here.
That's my title.
Here, here, and here come the footnotes.
Yeah,
in fact, it's not a footnote. Well, I'm going to introduce a third factor that is very relevant to universities, I think. And that is both rear view mirror and the present, and I hope the future. I agree completely that if we're talking about fundraising from third parties, the digital mindset is a critical way to go, and I love the distinction that Ben just drew between the tools and the really the way to think and creatively be artistic about it, right? But I think there is with this picture of funding that is seen as sort of an external thing to universities, there's something slightly disingenuous about it, or maybe even confused. The numbers that Sarah has cited, the numbers that Ben has given us, make very clear what the limits are to that external funding, and that really the role of the NEA, IMLS, the NEH, and our types of organizations, if you believe in them, is one of validation and also catalyzation for further fundraising that you can parlay into the digital mindset and so forth. But there's something else to think about. I would think that if we looked under the hood of your research university budgets, you would quickly realize that for all the funding we provide or your digital fundraising campaigns provide, that a huge part of your funding is baked into your business models. And sure, part of that is annual funds, a part of that is endowment draw for the lucky university among us that are very endowment dependent, very few are. Where does most of the money come from, other than research grants and philanthropy? It comes from tuition. And the way those tuition dollars get redistributed by provosts and deans is really where most of the action is in your big organizations. And that to me is a very interesting thing to think about for this group and with this group. because it speaks to making the case for why this whole matter of the arts inside universities matters. Why should universities, which are traditionally very logocentric and quantitatively oriented, why should they worry? What is the argument for them needing the arts in and across their curriculum, in and across their research portfolio? To come to us for funding for that, Ben has already told you he's not going to give it to you. It's not in his charter. For us, it could work if the case is made persuasively. And I think that's one big question, even for this wonderful A2RU initiative. Because as I look at all the work that's being done, I can see that in the different universities, there are very different motivations for it. I myself, I'll give you my cards, I see two reasons to think about it, two buckets of reasons. One is very instrumental, and it is about the future of the arts and having a captive audience of really smart people, young people for the most part, who want to learn as much as they can. You have them captive for 3 to 5 years, say something like that. And since you have these artistic resources, look at Iowa State University, even if they're engineers, even if they're medical students, even if they're whatever, history students, mathematicians, they ought to get some kind of exposure within the liberal arts education to it, so that when they get out, they contribute. They contribute to the digital mindset fundraising. They are members of their communities. Perhaps they participate in community theater and so forth. So this is sort of the sense that you prepare them for a meaningful life, but at the back of my head is also as a funder, gee, these people are going to give money to this. This is important for the long-term sustaining of the arts by their communities. It's the only way it will work on the local level, as Sarah has said. But the second reason is one that I think is philosophical and intellectual and much more critical to the life of universities as they enact their role as the producers, the stewards, the transmitters of knowledge. And that is to say that human enterprise isn't only verbal and quantitative in the way that I've described. It is a whole huge swath of human history, production, psychology, cannot be known and understood without taking into account artifactual knowledge, processes of making, the mysteries of human creativity, design, composition, and so forth. All sorts of processes that can't be fully commensurately captured in words, movement, and so forth. And so I think engaging your provosts, your deans, your wonderful president here in that question as to why it matters, not just because the arts need this, but because the arts have something to give and contribute to the intellectual life and the educational mission of the institutions. So I think that's the really big funding game.
From the wonderfully philosophical to the mundane.
Right.
I want to talk about federal giving for a minute because I think there's a conversation happening here that I witnessed in a number of other fora like this, and that is I'll say it, an obsession with the budget of IMLS, NEA, and NEH. We are a rounding error, mathematically, in a number of other discretionary budgets, right? Nothing controversial about that. We are mathematically a rounding error. $500 billion are distributed in discretionary grants from the federal government. $500 billion, right? It is a very, very porous system. And you all work not just in the arts. That's something that, though I'm new to this group, it's clear that this is a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, I don't know how many terms, adjectives you all have come up with, but you operate in many, many different spheres. And I can tell you that there are other agencies whose individual programs that address interdisciplinary arts giving, their individual programs are larger than IMLS's entire budget. So I think it's very important for you to think across the federal government as an opportunity, as a place for you to look for support. And this is where I'll also go into the mundane information about grant reform. In the not too distant future, it'll be pretty easy for you to track, for anyone, for Joe the plumber, whomever, to track where federal grant making goes from an individual agency right down to an organization, as long as it has a DUNS number. And this is not something that's that easy to do now. And what that means is that you'll be able to aggregate the grants that go to, let's say, Hopkins. I'll just pick an organization that gets a few grants from the federal government on an annual basis. And you'll be able to track that money from HHS, from DOD, from IMLS, and aggregate it. And the open data initiatives of this administration, and I will assure you of future administrations, regardless of party, the open data initiatives will make it such that we will have a different sort of conversation about the way in which discretionary grant funds are distributed in the United States. The availability of that information, access to that information, is going to engender completely different conversations about how grant making is done across the federal government, across different agencies. And I would submit to you that this group has an opportunity to think far beyond the three cultural agencies we've talked about, even though I'd like to think that ours is the most important of the three.